Okay, I think I'll start, given we've got a reasonably short space of time. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Charles Douglas, and this is the second in a series of webinars where we look at American politics, economics, and foreign policy, and its impact on the globe, but in Africa, on Africa in particular. For those of you that joined our last webinar on this topic, it was actually held before the US elections, and there we unpacked various themes, including the state of democracy in the US, the election process, and what would be the possible impacts if Biden won, which I have to say was predicted by our panel at that time. And we have the same panel today that we had for our first webinar. So it's now just over 150 days into his presidency, and a lot has happened. As you would have seen, there's recently been a very successful summit with EU and NATO countries, a contentious but pretty uneventful meeting with Russian President Putin, promises delivered in terms of getting 250 Americans vaccinated within the first 100 days. And we thought as a group it would be good to get back together again and assess the initial impacts of the Joe Biden administration and its potential influence on global affairs, but as I say, with particular focus on Africa as a whole. So very pleased and grateful to be able to moderate and then to welcome back our same panel. Firstly, that includes my colleague, Millard Arnold, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Carter administration, the first ever Minister Counselor for the Commercial Affairs for the African continent under the Clinton administration, and is now a Senior Advisor here at Bowman's. He's joined on the panel by Professor John Stremlau, who is an Honorary Professor of International Relations at Wits University, and he founded the Center for Africa's International Relations in 1998. He is also a former Deputy Director for Policy Planning in the Office of the US Secretary of State. Herman Warren is also with us again. He is a director for the Economist Group's corporate network, a former management consultant with Bain & Company, and has held other senior posts in both public and private sector corporations. So welcome again to our panel, and thanks so much for joining us again today. We look forward to the discussion. Before we get into the detail, we are hoping, we've got an hour, but we're hoping that there will be time for questions. So the order of events is that I'm going to put some initial questions to each of the panelists, and then we hope that we'll have 15 to 20 minutes towards the end, where we'll try and take some of the questions. So you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and as we go along, we'd just really encourage you, if you want to pose some questions, to pop them in there, and we'll try and take some of those questions. So getting back to the content, we'll start with you, Millard. Normally, one does this assessment traditionally at the 100 days in. It's actually 155 days since Biden became president, and it would just like to start with your views on how he's done so far and how he ranks against other US presidents. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you to those who are joining us from wherever, and to my colleagues on the panel as well. Much is made of the first 100 days, and I think the fact is that there's nothing inherently significant about the first 100 days of any president. There's no law that mandates it. The Constitution doesn't require it. It's a symbolic marker, a kind of a litmus test, a standard for gauging presidential effectiveness. The idea of the 100-day milestone has its origins in the 1932 election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Roosevelt was elected, the country was facing the Great Depression, was in its fourth year, and in fact, it was a global depression, a global pandemic. There were massive bank failures. The unemployment rate was over 25%. Businesses were collapsing. There were those who believed it was the end of the free market experiment and the future of Western civilization. Roosevelt said, and famously, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." He realized that action was needed and offered Americans a New Deal. Immediately after being sworn in as president, he summoned Congress, which was at the time in recess. He summoned Congress to a 3-month special session in which 76 new laws were passed. He won a series of congressional ideas around social, economic, and job-creating bills. He also introduced the idea of a fireside chat in which he spoke to the American people about what it is that he was doing. And in one of those fireside chats, the president noted how busy and important his first 100 days have been. That's where the term originated, and the term has stuck. What's been the single most important achievement of Roosevelt's 100 days? Not that he reversed America's decline, but Roosevelt fundamentally expanded the reach and power of the federal government, and this is critical. He set in motion a political conflict and an ideological struggle that has lasted until today. What Roosevelt's first 100 days did was to solidify the idea and expansion and authority of big government, enabling a progressive agenda designed to enhance the country's well-being. Roosevelt's progressive movement was expanded and supplemented by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and particularly the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So we need to see Biden and the Biden administration in the context of this significant political crusade. Republicans and conservatives have been on a mission ever since 1932 to roll back the advances of Roosevelt and what they see as the tax and spend Democrats. Their high point, Reaganomics. It was philosophically an ideological alternative to the progressive movement. As Ronald Reagan once remarked, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Most Republican administrations have tinkered at the edge of undermining the advancements made by progressive Democrats. Not so Trump. He bludgeoned the government, gutted agencies, and bulldozed departments, leaving them in shambles, whether it was justice, energy, the State Department, education, you name it. He destroyed the infrastructure of government. Biden's Build Back Better is an attempt to restore authority and purpose to government. So, turning to Biden's first 100 days, let's start at the beginning. He inherited a disaster of epic proportions from Donald Trump. A country in the midst of a deadly pandemic, more Americans dead in 18 months than in 4 years of World War II. A country with a crippled economy, more than 18 million Americans dependent on unemployment benefits, nearly 81 million Americans struggling to meet basic household needs. A country traumatized and appalled by racist police violence. A country staring at a climate change doomsday scenario. And finally, a country reeling from the January 6th coup attempt. On day one, Joe Biden faced an uncertain, angry, polarized, and in many instances, bitter America at war with itself. Like Roosevelt, Biden's task was a domestic challenge, and that was to fix a broken America. He saw himself initially as he said, a transitional president, and his resume, historical background, and outlook would have supported that. He was a centralist. However, his first 100 days have proven him to be, at least in my mind, canny, shrewd, and politically astute. He under-promises and over-delivers. He promised, as Charles mentioned, he promised 1 million vaccines in the first 100 days. He delivered with over 250 Americans getting jabs in that time frame. He signed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan into law, which itself changed the course of the COVID-19 pandemic and aided the country's recovery from the crisis. It was about leadership. The US economy added 1,384,000 jobs, the most new jobs in the first 100 days than any president on record. He proposed a sweeping $2.3 trillion infrastructure package known as the American Jobs Plan. And again, this is shades of Roosevelt. The vast majority of the money in his stimulus plans goes to poor working class and middle class Americans. Now, Herman will break all this down and talk about this later. He may or may not agree with me, but in short, the vast majority of Americans will receive some form of aid from the American Rescue Plan. And this is important, and I'll refer to that later. What he really did, however, was to elevate himself to the level of Roosevelt. He offered a bold and transformative plan to improve American society. He laid the foundation for a liberal or progressive revival in the United States, and he rejected the Reagan-era notion that wealth and income would trickle down. Ideas that many thought to be impossible, he demonstrated that they are really achievable and necessary. I think it's an historical achievement. He has challenged the Democrats' ingrained belief that if they embrace aggressive liberal policies, they'll lose elections. He went from a transitional president to what I believe is at the moment a transformative president. In fact, now the 9 most comforting words in the English language are, I'm from government and I'm here to help. And for all of that, Joe Biden's approval rating beats only Donald Trump and Gerald Ford's 100-day score. And why is that? Because there is only so much you can do when half of the Senate is, no matter what you say, going to be 100% against you. He's only passed 11 bills, but has signed a staggering rash of more than 100 executive orders, the most in American history. Why? Because he doesn't have overwhelming Democratic majorities in Congress behind him. The Senate is split 50-50, giving Republicans filibuster power, which we saw this past Tuesday. But the bigger problem is many don't believe Biden is the president. Trump's refusal to concede, his basic big lie and the election was stolen, the January 6th attempt to hijack Biden's victory, and on that same day, 147 Republicans in the US House voted to overturn the results of the November election, and there was no evidence of any voter fraud at all. Even today, 61% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen from Trump. And why is this? And part of this, I think, is because Trump's 74 million voter turnout was the most by any sitting president, and the second highest total only topped by Biden's 80-odd million. The people who support Trump really want to believe that he did not lose the 2020 election. He is the most popular Republican in at least a generation, and they believe that any Democrat election victory should not be recognized because they are inherently either illegitimate as a result of fraud, manipulation, or that the voters themselves are not true Americans. As a consequence, they have this insane belief, many do anyways, that Trump will be, quote, reinstated in August. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows this, but this is important because there is an indictment in New York, which will probably come out in July, and it may well be targeted at Donald Trump. And it would mean, in effect, his inability to, quote, be reinstated in August, which could lead us to another January 6th response. In short, the future of the country, however, turns on who prevails in the 2022, I think, by-elections. As we said earlier, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump personally can't stand each other, but they have a common interest, and that is to ensure that the country is ungovernable. They want to make sure that Biden cannot achieve anything. Republicans are now engaged, in my view, in a coordinated nationwide effort to keep Black and brown people from voting. The sobering fact is, if I'm correct, one of the country's two main political parties, the Republicans, is pretty much openly against democracy. The defeat this past Tuesday of Biden's hallmark efforts at safeguarding voting rights and ensuring racial justice, I think, is but a pertinent reminder of the precarious limits of Biden's power. However, despite this, I think Biden has played his cards very well so far. His strategy is basically to use the resources of the government to improve the lives of enough people to do everything possible to bring prosperity, on the theory that prosperity will take the edge off a lot of Republican support. He has a little more than a year to solidify his election chances and to lay a foundation that will ensure that Democrats prevail in 2022. Will he succeed at this? At this stage, I don't know.
Yeah. Thanks, Millard. You've certainly taught me a couple of things. You've set a great context for us. I think there's some sobering thoughts in there, but also appreciate your comments about a progressive revival as well. And I see you also setting the scene for a third webinar, because clearly not all questions can be answered at this point. But yeah, thanks again. I guess turning now to more of the economics and the economics policy. So Herman, against that background, what are you seeing in terms of Biden's approach, and particularly with the focus on economics and economic policy?
Sure. Thank you, Charles, and good day to everyone in general, my panelists in particular, my fellow panelists in particular. The United States doesn't exist as an island. It is a significant economy, and it is the largest economy, but it exists within the global economy. And it goes without saying, the global economy was rocked by the demand and supply side shocks introduced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year, the global economy contracted by 3.8%. That's an average, obviously, and averages can be somewhat misleading. It's always important to unpack them. And when you do, some economies actually grew. And the second largest economy, the source generally believed to be the origin of this novel coronavirus we're still contending with, and those of us in South Africa definitely know that, and in Gauteng in particular, in the midst of this third wave, which is China, second largest economy. That economy actually grew last year by 2%. And in fact, in the African context, there were some, Africa experienced its first recession in 25 years, but there were some economies in this region that grew as well. South Africa clearly was not one of them, with a 7% contraction, but Kenya grew, Tanzania grew, Egypt grew, among others. Specifically in the United States, it performed better than the global economic average. It contracted, but not by 3.8%, but by 3.5%. What helped that better than average performance? Well, Millard kind of touched on it in part. It was this tremendous emergency relief, fiscally speaking, response to the pandemic to protect lives and livelihoods. to give you a sense of how much money has flowed into the US economy above and beyond what would normally be expected in a typical non-pre-pandemic year, there was $5 trillion of emergency relief spending between March 2020 and March 2021. That's roughly equivalent to 25% of the U.S. Economy, again, to address the issues of failing businesses and people not being able to feed themselves and pay rent and so on and so forth. In addition, and Millard touched on this point, there was an aggressive rollout of vaccines, which built additional momentum as Biden took office. And the outlook for the U.S. economy in the current year is pretty bright. So it's expected the U.S. economy will grow around 7% this year. If you were to look at the kind of trajectory from a growth perspective the U.S. economy was on pre-pandemic, it's actually looking like it's in a much better place now at the top line, at least. But as I pointed out with the global economic outcome, the average contraction of 3.8%, you really have to unpack that because there are still a lot of Americans struggling. As we sit today or watch today from our screens, the unemployment rate in the United States is around 5.8% plus minus, much lower than it was at this time last year. But there are still millions of people who are without jobs, who were employed pre the pandemic. So as Biden comes into office, his priority is to address the economic imperatives, the social justice related issues that Millard touched on. And this is reflected in the plan that he has put on the table. Millard highlighted I believe the American Jobs Aspect Plan, which is around $2.3 trillion. There's an American Families Plan aspect to the Biden plan as well, and that's $1.8 trillion. So collectively, we're talking about another $4 trillion in spend envisaged by the Biden administration. Part of that plan would deal with the infrastructure deficits, which are significant. There was a recent report by the American Society of Civil Engineers highlighting that the infrastructure gap in the United States is $2.6 trillion. And that if it's not addressed over the medium to long term, say by the end of the 2020s, it would result in significant amounts of lost GDP in the billions, as well as tens of millions of fewer jobs. So Biden has targeted part of this package at addressing that infrastructure gap, both in hard and soft infrastructure. He's addressing or targeting a large amount of this cash as well on the social spending side, on healthcare and education and so on and so forth. As Millard highlighted, however, it's a very divided and I would argue poisoned political environment. So the $4 trillion is a big number in anyone's language. It's around 20% of GDP, but don't count on it passing because he would need to get this through Congress legislatively. And the only way you can do that with a simple majority, which is what the Democrats just have, is through a budget reconciliation process. And although there are 50 or so senators in the upper house, the Senate of the U.S. Congress, they don't all who are Democrat. They don't all see things the same way. There are some very conservative Democratic senators, for example, Manchin out of West Virginia, or the senator out of Arizona. Her name escapes me. I think it's Sinema, who don't like the budget reconciliation process, who come from, as I highlighted, very conservative states. So cobbling together a consensus to get things through is a very tenuous process. It's likely, however, that some portions of the Biden plan will pass. There is agreement, as much as strange as that may sound, when one talks about the American political system, in a few areas. Infrastructure is likely to resonate across the aisle. The manufacturing kind of enhancing the manufacturing base and R&D is likely to resonate. And this ties in part with China being viewed as a strategic competitor that needs to be contained, which Professor Stremlau, I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit more detail. There are concerns, given this $5 trillion that I mentioned earlier, as well as some portion of Biden's plan that likely will be passed. And I think the likely period is kind of the last quarter of this year. It may be up to half of his plan in some of those key areas, R&D, manufacturing, infrastructure, and so on. But there's some real concern that there's too much money being injected into the system. And we're seeing some of this play out. For example, if you look at the inflation numbers coming out of the United States. So the inflation numbers coming out in May, 5%, highest number in 13 years since the global financial crisis. And the concern is that it may not be short-term in nature. It would cause a normalization of monetary policy or approach, i.e. a rise in interest rates, and that increase in the cost of money would scupper what is still a somewhat fragile economy. And given the fundamental role the United States plays in the global economy, it almost sets the mark for the price of money for everyone else. The US dollar is the significant kind of reserve currency. It represents over 40% of international payments, sits on central bank balance sheets around the world as a reserve currency. That it possibly could contribute to fiscal pressures that countries are already experiencing. And in 2020, there were 6 countries that defaulted on their debt, one of them not too far north from us, which is Zambia. So there are real concerns that this normalization of interest rates would have knock-on effects which aren't great. Having said that, the money that has flowed to assist Americans hasn't just stayed in America. And one of the examples that one could look to for evidence of this is on the remittances flows. So remittance flows last year were down around 2%, so much less than the contraction in the global economy. But just like the average, there are those that kind of are above it or below it. And we saw increased remittances, for example, flow from the United States into Mexico. And linked to this flow was as people got over their anxiety. We've seen globally household savings increase, certainly in the United States. That's happened. People worried about job security for themselves, for their loved ones, and so on. As this money flowed and some of those anxieties eased, and other parts of the world were being hit by this pandemic economically and otherwise, and Mexico is a classic case. It's still grappling with the virus in ways that some other countries aren't necessarily. Americans with loved ones back in Mexico were sending a portion of their stimulus checks back to their loved ones in Mexico. We've seen similar things in the African context with Kenya, where there was nearly a 30% year-on-year increase in the remittances flowing from the United States to Kenya, and again speaks to how this money, which is going into the U.S. system, will not stay there. We are truly in an integrated, financially speaking and otherwise, world. One of the things which I think it's fair to mention that will be a constant between between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. So continuation, again, is this point that China is viewed as a competitor, and will need, and there are areas where one can cooperate, like climate change, and there are areas of contestation, and particularly in that technology sphere is where a lot of this contestation is taking place, and the kind of outcomes of the G7 bear witness to that, which I'm sure the professor will touch on. Another is that Biden is likely to maintain some of the protectionist tendencies that we saw under the Trump administration. And politically, the environment is not fertile to go against that particular grain. So I wouldn't expect that we'd see tariffs lowered, for example. I think that we'd still have stipulations around the sourcing of goods and services in a very America first kind of approach. And although I would argue, I'm not sure if my colleagues would agree, that for a number of traditional allies, and one may even argue for foes, Biden is a breath of fresh air because he's more of a traditionalist, he's a multilateralist, he's in some ways more predictable. I think many allies will be wondering how long might this last. I think Millard said that Biden has characterized himself as a transitional president. Well, what comes after him? Given that so many people in the United States believe that he, particularly Republicans, that he's an illegitimate president, and Trump or someone Trump-like may very well be back in the White House again soon. And what might that mean for America's traditional global leadership role and its relation in that sphere with allies and so on? What's different is Biden is a bridge builder. Millard talked about his ratings after his first 100 days, better than Trump, not as good as Obama's, but he's very conscious that he's coming into a very fractious kind of environment, very divided, and he's not going to inflame the wounds. He's going to try to have them heal with his policies, careful with his language, and so on. And as I've highlighted, he's an institutionalist and a multilateralist. So that's where you're going to see some clear differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Let me pause there.
Great, thanks, Herman. I think yeah, that throws a couple of extra questions, and if we have time, I'd like to just come back to you just to understand these remittance flows a bit more and how material they are. It sounds like quite a significant theme, and given the African context, it might be useful if you're able to kind of give a sense of quantum if we have time. But before we go there, just to remind participants, you've got a Q&A tab at the bottom. We really encourage you, if you'd like to put some questions to the panel, just pop it in there. And we'll pick it up and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. I think we should do. So we're gonna turn now to John. Obviously, as a professor of international relations, we've sort of dealt with the sort of setting the scene, the economic outlook. In terms of foreign affairs and foreign policy, there's obviously a lot that's going on. A lot of potential conflicts in different parts of the world, and also some issues to focus on in Africa as well. Ethiopia is one, Mozambique another. But to start, what I would like to do is just put it to you in general terms, John, as to your views as to how Biden is managing America's foreign policy, and then we might get into some specifics.
Thanks, Charles, very much. I appreciate it, and I appreciate my two colleagues. I agree with Millard that Biden has played his cards very well, and I agree with Herman that he's a very reliable partner, which is a big contrast from Donald Trump. And so I can be pretty upbeat, but you raised a number of specific questions which we can't deal with in 10 minutes. I will talk more generally in around three sort of broad areas. Had this meeting been held 100 days after Biden's election, I would have been less confident, but my message about Biden would have been essentially the same. And I'd like to say a couple of words about that. I'd like to say a couple of words about the summits that he just underwent in Europe that had as a subtext the China issue, and that will be my contribution on the broad geopolitical foreign policy front. And then finally, I'd like to say a little bit about democracies under stress, since we've had so much talk about this, but with regard to Biden and to Cyril Ramaphosa here. The rule of law is really at stake in both of our nations. It's at stake in so many ways in terms of international and global order. It's a growth industry for anyone who happens to be in a legal profession, Charles, in my view, but that's an aside. I just wish I had studied law rather than international relations some days this time. Biden, in his first 100 days, gave one foreign policy speech, and he did that at the Department of State on February 4th, and he talked about diplomacy being the returned modus operandi for US foreign policy, and multilateralism was back. Those were reassuring to Africa, although he didn't mention Africa in his February 4th address, and he kept it rather general and also gave his take on democratic values, the importance of alliance, the importance of partnerships, and indeed the contrast that Millard has drawn up with regard to the domestic cleavage has an international dimension to it. We are struggling in Africa and beyond with this question of authoritarian or illiberal electoral authoritarianism. In the case of Xi and in China and in Putin and Russia, it's full bore authoritarianism. And they dismiss the democracies as being too messy and incompetent of working. And I think Biden, and I agree with Millard, he's played his cards very well and shows that you can run in a democracy. On the other hand, he's huge. Now, after he address, he spoke to the summit.
John, I'm afraid your connection is not good.
My connection.
Let's give it a minute to the participants just to see if we can get John back. Okay. Right, while we wait for John to just rejoin, Herman, can I just come back to that remittances question and if you can just, I was curious as you were talking. I mean, it's obviously something that is quite material. While we just wait for John to get reconnected, can you just give a little bit of more of a sense of what kind of quantum or we're talking about in respect of that?
Sure. So global remittances, as I mentioned, fell last year to around $700 billion. It's quite a bit of cash, and there are large kind of, I guess, destinations for that cash. So if one were to look at India, we're looking at around 80 billion or more than 10% of that flow directed to loved ones from Indian expats back home and those they care for. I specifically highlighted two examples, and I have one of the numbers handy for one of the countries, which is Mexico. So in 2019, there was approximately $39 billion of remittance flows going into Mexico, and in 2020, there was around $1.5 billion more, so around $40.5 billion that flowed to Mexico. And I mentioned the Kenya example. I don't have the number offhand, but of the absolute kind of dollars that flowed into Kenya, but year on year, remittances into Kenya grew in part because 29% year on year growth coming from the United States into Kenya, whereas Kenyans sending money to their loved ones from who were based in Europe back into Kenya. There was a fall from that particular tributary of the flow.
Okay. Great, thanks. John, are you back in sound?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, we can hear you, which I think we carry on that base. We lost him again. It wouldn't be a virtual webinar without some virtual problems. While John's trying to get sorted, there is a question here from one of the participants. Millard, I think I'll direct it at you, if I may. It sort of talks to some of the themes you picked up earlier. Question is, to what extent has Trump alienated the West, Europe in particular, and China, so that bridge building can be truly effective, specifically because of limited power in the Senate? So I think it's a question about, have bridges been burnt, or can they be rebuilt? And it picks up on some of your themes. If you're able to sort of give a little bit of extra commentary on that.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Look, there is little doubt that Trump's 4 years in office alienated much of the Western alliance, and they were more than pleased to see his backside out the door. But I think Herman made a point as well. There is a great deal of uncertainty and concern as to whether or not Biden is just a blip in the road toward a more fascist, more authoritarian America, or is this really a turnabout that they can rely on? And so much is going to be at this stage, I think, conditional upon how things turn out again in 2022. If the Democrats are able to marginally increase their holdings in both the Senate and the House, it will indicate the direction in which the country is headed. But if they lose seats in the Senate or lose more seats than they did in this election in the House, I think our Western and many of our allies elsewhere will have great concerns about the future relationship with the United States. And John's back, and he's probably in a better position to take that on.
Hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, John. Do you want to have a bash?
Well, it's challenging me because I wasn't reading. But let's just do a truncated and my 7 some made there, reestablishing good relations also with in his remarks on Africa. After the G7.
John, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. We're only getting every couple of words. Do you want to try turning off your camera? And then we'll see if that gives you a bit more bandwidth. Okay, have a bash now. Okay. I think we're going to have to, unfortunately, unless John is able to come back strong, we'll have to let him go. Herman, do you want to, this question's just been asked about South African remittances. Before I go back to a question for Millard, is there anything further you want to say there? There's obviously some South African interest, some South Africans who want some dollars.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think Louise Bruchman may have asked that question, and I typed a response to her. I don't know the number offhand of the remittances that flow to South Africa or from South Africa. A great source for this, which I highlighted to Luis, is the World Bank site, and I'm sure that that any number of angles one wants to look at it regarding remittance flow related to South Africa and otherwise one could find there. But apologies, I don't know the number offhand.
Okay, cool, that's fine, thanks. So, and then I'll come back to you, Millard. I think there's two topics that maybe we would have relied a little bit on John for as well, but I'm hoping you might have some thoughts. The first is just to, particularly with an Ethiopian focus, an African focus, any commentary in respect of the situation in Ethiopia and, you know, whether the US might weigh in on that one or not. If John comes back, he can also help us with that. The other one, which we sort of touched on just fleetingly, is the meeting between Biden and Putin, we haven't really had too many thoughts about that. So if either of those questions you're happy to take, then would appreciate just a couple more thoughts on those.
Sure, but John is back. Go.
John is back, but I think we'll see if his connection is better, but I think it's not, unfortunately.
Okay. Look, I'll take a stab initially at Putin and then come back to your first question. I think the thrust of many in the US government and those who are interested in the approach America takes toward the world at large were concerned that Biden, in their words, elevated Putin to a position of being on the world stage and showcasing him and allowing him to have a profile that perhaps he didn't deserve. Biden has taken the view that you need to have face-to-face contact and that you need to talk to folks, whether they are friends or adversaries. And I am inclined to agree with him. I think he demonstrated a couple of things in so having this meeting with Putin. One, that he was more than comfortable taking on a challenge of this nature that many people thought was a mistake. Secondly, he had a sense of being able to demonstrate firsthand to Putin that I am your equal, that I am as strong as you are, and that I am prepared to take you on. Thirdly, in some of the comments he made following the meeting itself, he said no threats were made and that it was a congenial and atmospheric kind of discussion. But in actual fact, he laid down some heavy lumber. He made it very clear that if something were to happen to Navalny, what would be the consequences of that? He talked about how would Putin feel if there were to have some kind of cyber attack on their pipelines in Russia. I mean, he did it all in a very gentle way, but I thought that he was very, very clever and shrewd in the way that he approached things. Now, there are some concerns I have with that, because clearly if you make threats of this nature, and Obama had the same situation in Syria, if you cross a red line, then this is going to be our response. But I think it was important that he let the world know that, as he constantly has said, the United States is back. I'm going to stop again to give John a shot at this if he's on, and if not, I'll pick up the second question.
You hear me at all?
Yeah, we can hear you, John.
Well, I don't dare, we're close to the end. Maybe Millard ought to follow that, and I memos or relationship.
Yeah, okay. John, I tell you what we're going to do. Let's let Millard, because yours is not working, unfortunately. That's a shame. Millard, do you want to finish that one off? And then if you can, if you're happy to comment on Ethiopia, and then Herman, I just want to come to you a little bit, if you can, on China relations. I know that was something that you were going to comment on a little bit, or more from an economic perspective, if you prefer. But let's let Millard close that out, and then I'll come to you, Herman. And if others want to put questions in the Q&A, please go ahead.
I'm not sure what I can add on Ethiopia. It is a troubling circumstance that's unfolding there. And this is a country that had so much promise 2-3 years ago to see it descend to where it is today. Is there something the administration should do, the Biden administration should do? It would be, I think, an important signal from Biden and the American new administration to take a more positive and proactive role in Ethiopia. What that role may be, I don't know, but certainly a dialogue should be opened, and I would think that it wouldn't be a bad thought to have an embassy, I'm sorry, to move into Ethiopia and hold discussions with Abiy and the forces in Tigray. There are limited amounts of things that the US government is able to do, but it strikes me showing attention to a problem and attempting to at least serve as a catalyst for its solution might be a big help. I'm sorry, I'm not really able to add much more to that, and perhaps either Herman, and if John is able to pick it up, he can do so as well.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm also mindful of time. I want to just give Herman a chance to talk about, within the context of the economic analysis, the sort of American response to China in general, but there's, to the extent possible, with a focus on Africa. And one of the questions that's come in, which you may have seen, Herman, as well, is particularly focusing on how America responds or is interested in the China Belt and Road Initiative, and how that relates to Africa. So that's a pretty broad question. You've pretty much got free rein to say what you like. But yeah, if you can maybe touch on some of those themes in our last couple of minutes. Thanks.
Sure. And maybe let me start on the Belt Road Initiative side, which is China and particularly President Xi's approach to extending Chinese influence, supply chains, securing critical routes linked to China's strategic objectives. And one could argue that the United States, specifically the West in general, has been caught napping. I highlighted in my opening remarks about some of the risks around interest rates, the normalization of monetary policy, the pressure that would put on countries in particular to service their debts. Well, if you look at who is the largest creditor globally, it's China. I mean, China has extended more loan funding than the IMF and the World Bank combined. And a lot of that funding has been extended to countries that are critical to Chinese interests. In Africa, for example, you'll see a lot of funding in Angola that's linked to China making sure that it's secured its hydrocarbon needs, oil, and DRC, copper and cobalt, very important minerals in the kind of green economy. If you're thinking about batteries or electric vehicles and so on and so forth. Biden is certainly aware of this. Again, the kind of positions that were put forward and the statements emanating, for example, from the G7 bear testament to this. One of the important I suppose, planes of the battlefield that's coming into clear focus is on vaccine diplomacy. And how different countries are approaching this. China, most certainly, one of the reasons why Zimbabwe is a bit further down the vaccination path than even South Africa is because of Chinese vaccines, which have landed in Harare and other places to help them put jabs in arms. And we've seen similar moves taken by the Russians, not just with distributing kind of produced vaccines, but also technology transfer so that their version, their country source version or versions of the vaccines can be manufactured in places like Brazil and other jurisdictions. And the Biden administration, quite early, in fact, before the G7 took place, started to show that this was recognized, that in a sense, none of us is safe until we all are, but vaccines could play an important role in the strategic interest of the United States. Earlier this year, we saw actions by the Quad, and that's a grouping between India and the United States and Japan and Australia, committing money and actual doses, about $1 billion, to try to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak in Southeast Asia. So this is a part of strategic interest and an understanding of this contestation. Again, what will be a carryover from Trump into Biden, that China is a strategic rival, and there will be areas of cooperation, but important areas of contestation.
Thanks, Herman. I see we've come to the end of our time. It leaves only for me to thank our panelists for joining us once again. I think we've left some questions unanswered in terms of direction of travel, and maybe that we can revisit these topics again at a later stage. So thanks to the participants for joining. I hope everyone keeps safe and healthy wherever you are in the world. And the rest of us here in Johannesburg, where we are in the middle of our third wave. And so it's top of mind at the moment. But thanks for taking the time to join, and keep well, and we will speak again. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to the panelists. Cheers. So this is an extension of the webinar that we did last week in relation to assessing Biden's new administration, 150 days in. Professor John Stremlau was part of that panel, but was struggling a bit with the connection. So John, it's great to have you back. And thanks so much for making some time just for us to have a further chat so that you can provide your input. And then we're going to send this little excerpt along with the recording of the original webinar. So just as a reminder, we spent some time looking at the first 155 days of Biden's administration. Then we had a particular focus on the economic aspects that have been considered since then. And so today, with John in attendance, we're going to be focusing a bit more on international relations and foreign affairs. Just to repeat, John is an honorary professor of international relations at Wits University. He founded the Center for Africa's International Relations there in 1998, and he is also a former Deputy Director for Policy Planning in the Office of the US Secretary of State. So John, thanks for being with us. I guess the first question within the context of how we started these webinars, which was looking at things prior to the election, is from a foreign affairs and international relations perspective, what has changed in your view, looking back over the last 155 days, and how is Biden different to the Trump administration?
Well, I thought, thank you, Charles. It's nice to be back, and I'm glad, and I hope this connection continues unabated, and we can have a conversation, because Donald Trump was as different from Barack Obama as Joe Biden is from Donald Trump. So I think there are a lot of head snappings going on around the world in foreign ministries. And if you're a democratic government, like we have here or like we have at the G7, you're very relieved to have Joe Biden as president. But yet you must wonder whether or not Trump could have a resurgence, because it's a very narrowly divided Congress, as Millard Arnold recounted for us the last session. And Biden has got a huge agenda that he's undertaking simultaneously, not only trying to make government relevant for the people, unlike the Republicans who think government ought to get off your back, but also to deal with civil rights. So in a sense, he's doing both Lyndon Johnson's work in civil rights and Franklin Roosevelt, who was in fact a segregationist in practice, because his alliance was with the South and back in the 30s. And he's trying to do it all at once with a very narrow majority. So governments everywhere are wondering, as you must be at Bowman's, what is the future for Joe Biden? I am a lot more confident about that 155 days in than I was at 100 days in. 100 days in, I would have talked about Biden's only comment thus far, actually, on foreign policy, which was at the State Department on February 4th, in which he emphasized diplomacy and multilateralism. He did not mention Africa, but he did mention processes which Africans hold very close to their priorities. And so in that sense, it was reassuring. And 4 days later, on February 8th, he addressed the African Union Summit, the first American president to do so. He did so virtually. And he stressed not only was he back, he would be supporting climate change, which is a concern to Africa, and COVID vaccines and their distribution, which has been a real sensitive issue in the US-Africa relation, as you know. And he pledged, quote, "The US stands ready to be your partner in solidarity, support, and mutual respect." Now that sounds very general, but it's at the same time, it's reassuring when you think of the way Donald Trump disregarded African countries and called them an expletive. In fact, also, I think I need to stress up front, the African Charter for Democracy, Elections, and Governance that governments here are all committed to, plus the Constitutive Act of the African Union, are at their heart democratic. So while Africa has good relations with China, and it also could have good relations with the Biden administration, and that was my taking off point. Since then, of course, we've had the G7 summit, and we may want to talk a bit about what happened and transpired in that front.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, John, let's go straight in there, because I guess the other difference between 100 days and 155 days, if my math is correct, is as you say, the G7 summit, involvement with NATO leaders, the meeting with Putin. So would really appreciate your thoughts on that. And in particular, obviously from an African perspective, was very positive to see our South African president participating in the G7 summit. So if you could give some thoughts within the context of those aspects.
Yes, I'd be happy to, because I think it was a kind of a defining moment for the early part of the Biden administration. He's got legislative challenges galore, but he took time off to show his pragmatic centrism, but at the same time, principled pragmatic centrism in the G7 summit. And I think the European leaders and Japan were extremely relieved. And there was no question, there was before the summit, whether they might hedge their bets a little bit, because what if he loses his majority in 2022 election, congressional elections, or the election to the Trump supporters, or maybe to Donald Trump for a second term in 2024. And you could see the difference between the embrace of the democracies of Joe Biden in the communique, the extensive communique that was issued from the G7 summit in Cornwall in England, but also in the NATO summit. And in both of those, they did raise the China challenges and, of course, the Soviet misbehavior, particularly toward Ukraine, recently Belarus, the alliance that is concerning to the NATO countries. And when Biden met with Putin, you were reminded again that the authoritarian regimes, and I would expect China will be the same way, that feel that liberalism has had its moment, as Biden told the Financial Times a year ago, that they're hedging their bets. They sort of would like to welcome back Donald Trump, and we don't know what the oligarchs and Putin and the money that flowed into Donald Trump's coffers when he couldn't get any loans from normal banks. That's for lawyers to sort out, Charles, not for me. But it is a fact that the Helsinki meeting in 2018 was an embarrassment to the Republican Party, or it should have been, and it certainly was to America, where Trump was taking the word of Russian intelligence over his own intelligence organization's findings on the interference in the 2016 election. So that what Biden was doing when meeting with Putin was just to show that Joe Biden, could deal with adversaries forthrightly, but at the same time was going to give no way, and therefore there was no joint press conference. And I thought he handled it very well, but of course all he had to do was show that he was different than Donald Trump. But to come back to the G7, Charles, that's really where I think we got a better idea of where the Biden administration is going with its diplomacy and multilateralism on things like climate change and getting the COVID drugs. And I was so glad that Cyril Ramaphosa was there as a guest on behalf of the African continent. And he was at pains in his press conference, Ramaphosa was, to make the point that Ramaphosa wishes that more African representation was at the summit, and particularly the African Union representation, because so much of the agenda that faces the continent is going to have to be supported by the West, but it's also going to have to be supported with China. So there's an opportunity, I think, for Africa to broker in the US-China relationship, and you may want to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was quite stark that our president was very careful about what he said about China's involvement in Africa and some of the other comments that were being made at the time of that summit. So what are your thoughts there, John, in terms of the interplay between China's involvement in Africa and Biden's new administration and a potential change in tack there?
Well, I think it's very, very significant, and his statesmanship, Ramaphosa's statesmanship, was really on display at his press conference, because you're correct. He was asked very pointedly, was he concerned about the increased competition and possible sort of Cold Warization of African politics, as we saw during the US-Soviet rivalry, with clients picked and competition driving really what was an anti-Soviet Africa policy on the part of the United States for much of the Cold War, than an African policy, than a pro-African policy. And so what he said was, Africa welcomes all partners. And he was right to say, and he was the only guest member at the G7. The other three were from Asia, and India, Australia, and South Korea are all part of the American anti-Chinese coalition containment coalition in the hotspot of Southeast Asia and South Asia. But Africa did not have to be a site of competition. It could be a win-win-win for the Chinese, the Africans, and the Americans if, as Cyril Ramaphosa carefully said, they offer us deals that we can trust and have comfort in and suits our interests as Africans, which is African agency. And I think there's a good possibility that Biden, who has stressed that he would cooperate with China where it suits mutual interests, could find a confidence-building opportunity here in the region. And I was very glad for for Ramaphosa to mention that. And I just might say, before I leave this subject, that personal relations mean a lot to Joe Biden. And Cyril Ramaphosa would remember, even though he was trying to deal with an apartheid regime that was trying to put him in jail back in the 80s, in 86, it was Biden who was most outspoken in the overthrow of the veto that Ronald Reagan had done to the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in Congress. That's probably Biden's most famous speech, was his anti-apartheid speech. And Cyril would remember that. But more importantly, Charles, because Biden is Biden, and Biden is a proud Irish American, and he is a proud Roman Catholic. And those are his identities, although he's ultimately a Democrat in a political sense. And he would remember that Cyril Ramaphosa's role in the Irish peace accord was absolutely critical. The IRA needed someone they could trust to monitor the demobilization of the arms, and Cyril Ramaphosa stepped up, and he selflessly committed himself to do that at some personal danger, according to the partner he had, Matti Ahtisaari, the former Prime Minister of Finland, in his autobiography. And what you see is a Biden who remembers, because the Irish peace accord is at risk under Brexit and all the problems. And someone asked him at the press conference, and Cyril said, oh, no. There were more important subjects on our G7 agenda than Brexit. But you could be sure that they talked Brexit, Biden and Ramaphosa is grateful for Cyril Ramaphosa's help on that front, I'm sure.
Great, and it's wonderful to consider those personal aspects as well as just the policy. John, thanks a lot. I think your comments can give us a sense of optimism for the way in which the relationship between Africa in general, you've focused quite a lot on South Africa, might develop positively under the Biden administration. We might need to catch up in another 155 days and see if we're still on track. But thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. And I'm glad we got this chance to connect.
Thank you, Charles. And it's really a matter of hope, not optimism.
That's the final word. Thanks, John, and thanks to our participants.